evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today for our live recording of the Inclusion Exchange podcast. It's really, really great to have so many of you attending today for our live session. One of the benefits of joining us live is that you do have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A box. So if you do want to ask any questions of our guest speaker throughout the session, please do feel free to post them there. We'll try and get round to as many as possible within the session, and we will, of course, get round to answering you via our website if we don't have time in the session. So please do participate as much or as little as you would like. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ayo Bali and my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Managing Director and Senior EDI Practitioner at Bakary Bali. And I set up Bakary Bali almost 2 years ago after working in a range of organisations focused in race equity and gender equity. And I decided to set up the company really to support organisations through my backgrounds, my expertise and things that I've seen working well when it comes to equality, diversity and inclusion. And we wanted to provide essentially strategic advice for organisations who didn't know where to start or were really struggling to make any visible progress. And we also wanted to provide mentoring and coaching to leaders, executives and teams who actively need to do the do in terms of putting those strategies into action as well. So we provide a range of learning and development support as well as our strategy advice. And please do check out our website if you want to find out a bit more about what we offer our clients. A big part of me setting up the business was to make sure that we provide knowledge exchange as part of this process. I think for too long we've seen minimal progress in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, and part of our mission is to create visible change. So we created the Inclusion Exchange, which is this podcast and our fortnightly blog, as a way to platform and feature fantastic people actually doing this work within organisations. So we are now on season 2, and this is our 6th episode. And if you want to hear from speakers from across the voluntary sector, media and news and the civil service, you are more than welcome to have a look at our season 1 recordings, which are available on Spotify and at YouTube as well. So please do have a look at that if you're interested. We wanted to do this session today really to mark Women's History Month. I started to think about what this session would look like towards the end of last year and really wanted to ensure that there was a focus on intersectionality and the differences of experiences that women in particular face when they've also got other elements of their identity which create instances of discrimination and instances of marginalisation and disadvantage when it comes to their experiences at work, but also their experiences within service provision. So I was really pleased to be able to convince Sanisha Wynter to join me on the podcast today to really help to unpick the topic, which is how we can start to hear unheard women, traditionally unheard women, and ensure that intersectionality is a core feature of our EDI strategies to make sure that we're able to make an impact on women across the board and not just keep impacting women traditionally who've benefited from a lot of EDI work and strategies who are perhaps from the majority group, white women, perhaps from middle class backgrounds. How do we look beyond that and understand the differences that women face who don't have that particular background? So really happy to have Sanisha with us. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her in a sec. But first, I wanted to just make reference to the fact that intersectionality was first coined by a US academic called Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a professor over in the US, and she coined the term in the late 80s when she was doing research around civil rights in the US, critical race theory, and she acknowledged that within the US legal system, that women of colour within the US were not necessarily having their racial identity as well as their gender identity referenced when it came to their experiences of discrimination within the workplace. And she describes intersectionality as an instance of when elements of our identities, our multiple identities, collide with power. So if you want to find out more about intersectionality as a concept, please do have a look at Kimberly Crenshaw and the kind of origins of the term. So at this point, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our guest before I invite her to join me. So Sanisha Wynter is a change management consultancy's head of EDI. She's worked in various sectors, which all aim to further inclusion and advocate for marginalised people in the workplace and communities. She's developed empowerment programmes and guidance on race equity, LGBT inclusion and disability accessibility. She identifies as a Black, bi, cisgender woman who lives and thrives with borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and mixed anxiety and depressive disorder. She's a mental health advocate and she aims to support others by sharing her lived experience of mental health conditions and her journey to recovery. She's committed to raising awareness of barriers to mental health access and support for diverse communities, and she does this by contributing to research, and she's also a member of the Black Women's Mental Health Board. In 2019, Sanisha was listed as Bi Icon of the UK LGBT charity Stonewall, and in addition, she recently became a Tedx Speaker, and she shared her message that vulnerability is a superpower. If you haven't already had a look, please do have a look, and we'll include the links to Sanisha and her talk in the show notes. So really, really excited to have Sanisha on board. Sanisha, would you like to come and join me on the podcast? Welcome. Thanks for joining. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's great to be here.
It's an absolute privilege to have you here. I first heard you speak around a year ago when you were talking on an NHS webinar, and I was absolutely blown away by the things that you shared. It really stayed with me in my mind and within my heart as well, in terms of your experiences. So I was so delighted when you kind of responded to my message and agreed to come and join us as a guest on the podcast, Sanisha. So thank you so much for being here. And our audience are definitely in for some real pearls of wisdom and practical advice, really, in terms of how they can really respond to some of the things that I know that you'll share with us today. So thank you so much. Now, I know this hour is going to absolutely fly by, so I'm going to jump straight into it, Sanisha. And I would love to start just if you could share a little bit more about yourself in terms of who is Sanisha and what's your origin story. And I'd love to know a little bit more about kind of how you got into what you do as well.
So I want to give trigger warning straight away because my talk will inevitably bring up biphobia, self-harm. We'll be talking about racism, of course, poor mental health, gender inequality, and health inequity in this talk. So do just take care of yourselves. And thank you so much for joining in live as well. And I hope that I'll be able to answer as many of your questions as possible. My origin story, or who I am, is still a question that I constantly have to unpick for myself of why do I do this work and why does it mean so much to me? I was born with a sort of notion of I shouldn't have necessarily been born at a very young age. I felt very much like I didn't belong. And the reason why I say that is because my mum had me a lot younger than she was planning to, and her family didn't really deal well with it. And I felt I shouldn't really be here at a very young age. And that narrative was something that just stayed with me. I then, unfortunately, due to issues that were happening within my home, had to move outside of an inner city borough where I'd grown up to a place that I was the only Black girl in my class. And so I became very acutely aware of the differences of race and how people could be racist and what racism looks like as a 7-year-old. And so I'm very much witnessing people talk about others in a way that's derogatory and talk about myself in a way that really impacted how I saw myself and my sense of self. And I felt quite uncomfortable with my personal identity. I then, having to navigate that at school was really difficult, but I think there was a driver within me that said, Sanisha, just keep your head down. You've got to do well. You've got to succeed. You're the first born of your family, and so you have a huge amount of responsibility on you. And I'm the oldest of 8, and so I felt I had a lot to prove to not only the world that had said my mum had me too young, so I shouldn't be here, but also to my siblings that no matter what our situation was, no matter how poor we were, I could achieve success. And so I really kept my head down as much as possible in school, even though we were constantly either labelled as angry or loud. And it was quite a frustrating place to be when you got to high school. And so you're in a more secondary experience of learning and you're feeling like, okay, I'm getting ready for the workplace or university, whatever comes towards me. but then you are being reminded that because of your race or because of your socioeconomic background, you are viewed as less than. And so that reminder of I don't quite belong or fit here stuck with me in a really painful way in high school. And I felt that I was associated with, just by being, one of the Black girls that sit with other Black girls, I was associated with being in a gang because I had Black friends in a white area. And so it felt very uncomfortable to even try to embrace Blackness or to discover what that was and to really get in touch with my roots of who I am. During this time as well, I'm battling with my sexual identity because I grew up under Section 28, which was a piece of legislation that effectively banned same-sex conversations at school. And so up until 2003, no young students were learning about other identities like that. Teachers weren't able to be out. And so I was constantly questioning my identity that I had told myself, but why do I want to be with this person who's the same sex as me? Is this allowed? Can I do this? But I also want to date this person and this guy's the opposite sex to me. And is this allowed? Can I be this person? And so I had that battling experience at a very young age. One of my friends came out and she was very similar to me, similar background, and she had a really hard experience. I witnessed how she was ostracized by the community as well as her family members, and people weren't really wanting to hang out with her at school anymore. And so I thought, there's no way I'm coming out. There is no way I'm talking about this. This is not a safe environment for me to be myself. I will never be able to be myself. And I thought, I'm going to go to university. I'm going to go on to be a teacher because that's what I really wanted to be. And I'm going to hide these feelings. At university, though, I went to the University of Portsmouth, and so I was far away from my very small London bubble. And I was able to start to explore my identity, explore who I was, even though I was facing small amounts of biphobia at times, where people questioning, oh, those people are greedy, or bi people, they don't really know who they are, or it's just a phase. I really started to unpick this identity of mine and started to explore being myself. When I finished university, I thought I would feel elated because, yes, I'm finally closer, one step closer to becoming this teacher I've always dreamed to be. Working with young people was a huge, and is still a huge passion of mine. And so I felt, okay, I should be so happy, but I wasn't. I was afraid. And the reason why I was afraid is because I knew that I would have to face an element of discrimination I wasn't ready for, even though I'd experienced discrimination at a young age. I knew that people of my background would not be able to succeed the same way, but due to conversations I'd had with other mentors or older Black women in certain positions. And so in Portsmouth is an area that it reminded me a lot of the deprivation within the borough that I lived in London. And it brought me back to that feeling that so many young people are told or made to feel that they shouldn't belong or that childhood isn't fair. And so I left university and I decided I'm not going to be a teacher just yet. I don't think that's my calling right now. I want to go and work with communities, and I want to be in touch with communities, and I want to talk to people. I want to meet people. I want to understand, what does it mean to feel like you belong, and how can I ensure that others feel that feeling? And so I went to work, and this is my first role, at voluntary community and social enterprise within my local borough. And there I was reminded of these inequalities, but I was also reminded of privilege and what privilege looked like. And I thought, how can I reshape that experiences for others? And so I would say that's how I started, that feeling of things aren't fair. I'm born on this planet and people are telling me this is your identity or this is how you should behave. And I'm given a narrative of this is the way you should walk through this world. And me saying, I hear that, I've experienced that, and I don't want that to be the narrative for everyone. And so my passion for young people, my passion for change for the future pushed me to keep doing this work of working with many different organizations to understand where are the inequalities and how can we ensure that everyone experiences the same level of privilege that I see constantly.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, I definitely chose the right speaker to talk about intersectionality. It's amazing, I suppose, the range of questions I suppose you must have had, and the othering as well growing up. I know from my own experience from a young age, it was very much around my race, because I grew up in a very white working class area in one of the most deprived cities in the UK. But similarly to your experiences, I had the assumption put on me that I was going to be aggressive, that I was going to be really good at fighting, and that I was going to be naughty. And I had that from a really young age, and didn't really understand at that point where that had come from, because that completely wasn't my personality. So I think it's a challenging time, isn't it, when you're growing up in that context? You're just trying to be you, but you're being told that what is you is something completely different based on other people's biases and stereotypes. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I was really interested in what you said about belonging. I don't know if you could expand on that a little bit. I was at a panel just last week and was asked a question about belonging, particularly in the workplace, and what it means to me. And I think I've got mixed views on it, just because I think when you're from a minoritized background and there's very few people who look or sound similar to yourself, is it a realistic prospect to actually find a sense of belonging there? Or do you actually have to look outside of work to make sure that you're a well-rounded person, that you've got your sense of belonging from other spaces? So I'm just curious to see what your perspective is on that view around belonging in terms of your own experience growing up.
Yeah, I think belonging is something that I think as humans generally we strive for. We want to find a place that says you fit here, or you're welcome here, or you're included here, you have a voice here. I think so many of us thrive of, even if we are introverted people and we like to either sit by ourselves, or we get energy of just being by ourselves and focusing on what we need to focus on, but having other people who are like-minded like us helps us. It makes us feel, okay, I'm allowed to be this way. And I think that's what belonging is, allowing somebody to be who they are instead of asking them to fit into a box. And so when I've interviewed in the past or worked with different organizations, and they're like, we're trying to find a good fit for us. And it's not asking people to fit in a box of a personality box, because you're asking somebody to put on a show for an interview or to put on an act to ensure they reach the role that you're hiring for, instead of actually embracing the idea of that person and getting to know the real person behind it. And so that's when the reason why I do the talks the way I do and the way I talk about my childhood is because I believe that's the foundation of who we are as an individual. And whether or not we are so different from that young person, that person made us who we are. And so I think it's so important for organizations to be so much more curious about the journey an individual has gone on, instead of what the CV says, because the CV might say one thing, but the journey shows a different level of resilience you could never understand without living it. And so I think belonging is important, and it's something that we crave as individuals, to feel we fit wherever we may fit. However, it's not for us, the fit to be tailored. It's not for you. We have to fit into the jacket. That's not going to work. The jacket has to fit us. And I think that's the important thing. You can't buy clothes for yourself and expect it just to mold. You've got to buy something that makes you feel good. And I think that's what we need to start pushing for when we talk about belonging, is to go back to focusing on the people instead of the organization saying, we've got a club like this. Can you be like us? No, we need somebody like you because you make us different. You make us diverse. And I think that's the beauty of humanity.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you for sharing that. So, yeah, I'd like to, because the theme of this talk is really kind of trying to raise awareness, I suppose, about what intersectionality is, and particularly in relation to what we're trying to do around equity and inclusion. So I'm curious to know what your view is on, I suppose, for our audience, if you could kind of unpick that from your perspective. Like, what does intersectionality mean to you? Why is it important? And what are some of the features of intersectionality as you see it?
So I think intersectionality, and once I've found out the definition and I actually explored it for myself, because there were many times when I would hear people describe intersectionality as, oh, my identities are intersectionality. And I was like, I don't get what you mean. What do you mean by that? Intersectionality as an identity It's not what it is at all. It's not about listing the fact that I'm a Black, bi, cis woman. Those are my identities, yes, but intersectionality is saying, these are my experiences because I'm Black. These are my experiences because I'm a woman. These are my experiences because I'm a Black woman, and actually really drilling down and looking at the complexity of our identities. I think it's so important for us to not just look at the glaring issues in our society when we're talking about women and we're focusing on, oh, well, women experience this. When you're talking about women, which women are you actually talking about? Which people of color are you actually talking about? And being very clear with our language. And I think intersectionality acknowledges that oppression can exist separately, but it can also exist in combination. And when we look at it with combination of recognizing that the intersecting forms can really harm an individual's experience or can really highlight their resilience, it provides us with an opportunity to, again, better understand that person, the core of the person or the core of their experiences. And so I really like to dismiss any sort of oppression Olympics of, oh, Sanisha, you've got so many diverse identities of this, and this. You've had it so hard and you're able to do this. That's all there and great, but it's not what intersectionality is for me. Intersectionality isn't me just listing my identities at you. It's you actually understanding my experiences and being curious about my experiences and understanding the way our society works through my experiences.
Thank you. Thank you. Really good to see it through that lens, I think. And I think particularly when working within organisations, for example, I work with a lot of organisations that are looking to improve and increase diversity and have made some advancements, particularly around gender equity, for example, at board level. But whenever I'm kind of having a look at who's on the board of trustees or at the executive boards, I do see a gender mix, but I'm not seeing any visible ethnicity, any visible differences in relation to ethnicity or race or, for example, visible disabilities. And so I just wonder, is there something that we're not getting right from your perspective that you've viewed in some of the work that you've done around how, how can we become more granular about the detail? How do we get away from just talking about gender to talking about intersectionality in a way that people get and a way that's actually progressive, so that we can start to understand the differences of experiences of women and the different barriers that they exist there. Sorry, that was a really long question. Hopefully you got the gist.
Yes, I do. But I think our identities are so complex and there's many different types of way to be a woman as well. And so and that's why I'm saying when you are talking about women, being very clear with who you're talking about, you have to recognize that for some women, some white women, for example, will experience white privilege, but they may also experience sexism because they're a woman. And so it's really important to be aware that there is a level of privilege in there as well as there is a level of oppression. By not talking about the other identities or by not being willing to really be granular with looking at data or calling a name when you are saying women, and instead of just being very clear and saying I'm talking about white women and how we have senior white women on our board, you continue to erase the experiences of other marginalized women. You refuse to acknowledge that their experiences also exist. And instead of grouping Black women as, oh, you're part of the people of color group, so we won't talk about you when we're talking about women, then how do you ensure that you are further dismantling barriers to their career or to their progression within your organization? So you have to be very clear with the language you're using in a way that ensures that nobody continues to be left behind. And the reason why I say that is because Black women experience a level of racism and a level of sexism that is unique. And it's unique depending on their class, depending on their sexual identity, depending on whether they're mothers or not. And so we have to be very clear with who we're talking about to ensure that we aren't leaving anyone behind. When we just use the term women and we mean white women, we're saying to Black women, we don't see you. And we've continued to have that narrative of we don't see you as women. Some people sometimes, when they're arguing a point, they say, oh, well, I'm talking about women here. And I don't want to conflate it or inflate it to race because it will confuse people. But for Black women, we can't leave that part of our race aside. And so by refusing to talk about race when you're talking about women, you are saying that that part of identity doesn't matter to you. And by that part of identity not mattering, you are not taking into consideration the journey that I talk about, the journey, the oppression that women face. And so you have to be very, 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 very specific in your language, because that's only by doing that, you give justice, I think, to Black women. You acknowledge that there is an ethnicity and gender pay gap for Black women. There is that underuse of their talent. Sometimes within the gender pay gap, people refer to, oh, but women are less likely to ask for a pay increase or promotion or really push for their career development, or they're too afraid to talk about salaries, for example, as an excuse for a pay gap. And we know that Black women, and this can be a detriment to who they are in the workplace, are outspoken. They are more likely to challenge senior individuals because they want change, because they are experiencing a level of oppression. And they are also more likely to want to really try to speak about their experiences in a way of, I feel I deserve this promotion because. And so Black women are very direct. And so using that excuse of women don't talk up for themselves in the workplace, which women are you talking about? Because Black women do. And so we shouldn't have that ethnicity and gender pay gap for us, but we do, because the willingness to challenge others, or the willingness to say enough is enough. I need something, I need change, or I need this to be advocated for me. The willingness to do that is seen as being a troublemaker or a problem, instead of saying, this is a leader, this is somebody who's decisive. And so the way we see certain traits that we attribute to men as great, Black women embody those traits a lot. However, we are not applauded for those traits. We are not celebrated for those traits. We are seen as troublemakers for those traits.
That's a really, really interesting insight. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, definitely would agree with what you've said there. And it's just made me think about, there was a research study last year that came out. It was called Broken Ladders. If anyone wants to have a look at it, it was seen and cited as kind of a landmark report, because it was coming together of the Fawcett Society that focuses on gender and Runnymede Trust that focuses on race. And they did a big review of particularly Black women and potentially other ethnic groups as well. I'll have to go and check. But what they found was that racism was the norm for women in the workplace in the UK. It was the absolute norm. That's what the statistic told us, that 75% of people responded, said that they had experienced racism in the workplace. And 30% of those women said that got to the extent of racial slurs. That's what they were hearing on a regular basis within the workplace. And there was also an interesting statistic about covering as well that would be interesting to get your perspective on, because there was a big disparity between Black women and white women in terms of feeling the need to cover elements of their identity within the workplace, which is interesting based on what you just said there. I think it was 61% of Black women said that they covered the way they spoke in terms of the language that they used, but also changed their hairstyles, in some cases changed their name, so that they would feel accepted within that workforce. And that compares to around 40% of white women who felt that they were covering an element of their selves at work. So what's your view on covering and kind of the impacts that has on people?
Yeah, I think covering is something that I navigated very early in my career. And I decided, because of what I'd experienced being younger and feeling like I don't belong, it was really negatively impacting my mental health, having to cover or not be myself or as much of myself that I felt comfortable to bring to work. And so, yes, even though Black women do have these traits which demonstrate us as amazing leaders in organizations, because we embody the traits that we applaud all the time as leaders, there is that part of us that we don't want to be labeled, because we have been labeled in the past as troublemakers. And so we will start to either cover, or we will code switch, or we will, as you said, change our hair or our appearance to seem more respectable or pleasing to others. And I think we have to, when we talk about Black women's experience in the workplace, we have to talk about navigating respectability, politics of being that good Black woman who has her hair a certain way or wears certain clothes that aren't figure hugging, etc., because of the stereotypes or microaggressions that are placed on her. I think a covering for me has always felt like if I speak out or if I be myself, I'm going to subject myself, and this has happened in the past, of subject myself to being seen as a troublemaker or intimidating to others. Intimidating because I'm expressing my creative thoughts or because I'm talking about myself in a way that's passionate. And so what that has led to multiple times of me leaving an organization because I feel like my voice no longer mattered, or feeling trapped at a junior position because I'm not seen as I'm contributing or being a team player because the team doesn't believe in my true voice. And so I think Black women and Black people in general have to constantly worry about their identities being a barrier to their progression and not feeling like they can be themselves. And for me, I've experienced somebody not saying my name correctly or my name being replaced or somebody saying, can I just call you Sally? I've experienced things which it's these small microaggressions that have chipped away at how I see myself. And especially as sometimes some of us see ourselves as representative for other minorities. So for other Black women, I can't let them think that all Black women are this. And so I have to behave like this. And so you feel so uncomfortable to really be yourself. There's no way you can grow in that organization for a long time, or you can really contribute in a way that's going to be productive because you're so worried that you're going to slip up when you code switch. And that's why I refuse to code switch anymore. I will just talk the way I talk with family and friends. I won't soften my voice. I won't make my tone higher to make other people feel more comfortable. But I've been through a lot to get to this position, and I want to make it for other Black women who aren't maybe in the same position as me. They shouldn't have to go through the negative to be able to come out the other side and say, well, I put my foot down. I refuse to be this way. I want to be myself. And so I think covering is a huge part of why we continue to be underrepresented at senior level, but also it really impacts the self-identity. I think with COVID, we saw so many more movements talking about anti-racism, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like since COVID, we've really become kind of lax in wanting to talk about these issues again, or seeing these issues as dire as we did after the murder of George Floyd. I think we've really stopped pushing, and not Black people, but I think the people who said they were allies to us in that time, it's really a question of where are you now and why do I no longer hear your voice? And why are you not pointing out this issue you knew was an issue 2 years ago or 3 years ago? And so the covering, sorry, this is long-winded, but it's exhausting. It's exhausting and it's painful. And I think it's a very unique experience for Black people of covering and changing themselves, molding themselves. Again, that good fit to fit into that old boys club. We have to edit, and it's hard and it's draining and it impacts people's mental health.
Thank you for sharing that. Lots to take away there in terms of those experiences, and just to again back up what you're saying, I suppose, in terms of some insights. So a think tank called Kirkwall did some research again, I think it was last year, specifically speaking to Black women about their experiences in employment and pulling out some of the views, particularly on like fair promotions and talent development, because I think a lot of organisations are focusing on diversity, widening the gate in terms of the talent pool, but when people are actually in those organisations, that's when the culture clicks in, and areas such as you've mentioned around kind of the microaggressions that covering happen, and also the barriers that people face in terms of when they want to naturally progress in their career, because obviously they're awesome, they're able to do that. Why wouldn't they want to progress? But around 81% of women that responded said that they identified that the progression routes within their organisation, the promotion routes, were unfair, and because of their identity as a Black woman, that was impacting their perception of being able to actually progress within that organisation. And within the same study, it said that over 50% of Black women were considering leaving their jobs, which is massively disproportionate when you compare that, for example, to white women. There's also been really recent evidence in the last couple of years, particularly around more Black women starting their own businesses as a result of the fact that they're actually not taken seriously, or they're not given the career opportunities that they are absolutely due to receive within work. So I think there's lots going on really in terms of how we can see this impacting Black women. And it's, I suppose, for organisations and for us to reflect on, like you said, what are we doing to make sure that this is a real sustained effort, and that we're acknowledging the seriousness of the talent, not only the talent loss, but the impact on people's well-being by not getting this right. So yeah, I thought that was a really, really insightful answer. Thank you for sharing it. I'd like to segue a little bit, because I know that you've got a lot of views and experiences, particularly around access to services. And I know we talk on this podcast quite a lot about workplace related issues, but I think that our experiences of access, particularly to health services as Black women and racialised groups, that there is a connection actually between us, our ability to be healthy and to get the health provision that we need, and our ability to perform at work and to be able to engage within employment. I think there's an intrinsic link there. So I'm just really curious to hear your views on that, and to maybe give a few insights, particularly for the audience, in terms of what some of the barriers are within health. We've talked about the barriers within work, but what are the health-related barriers that you've either seen or observed or experienced?
Yeah, so really, really important point. And I think, again, talking about health or health inequity, it cannot be removed from when we're having conversations about Black women in the workplace, because the health outcomes for Black people or other racialized groups are dire. Me in particular, because of my mental health illnesses, I was diagnosed, 5 years or so, with borderline personality disorder. And on receiving that diagnosis, you're already having to navigate a system that doesn't quite like people with that specific disorder, because you are seen as a problematic person and all these other negative stereotypes placed on borderline personality disorder. In the UK, it's even called emotional unstable personality disorder, but I choose not to use that term because it's quite scary when you say, oh yeah, I'm an emotional unstable person, when really I'm just a woman that's been through a lot of trauma. That's the true definition to me. I've got complex emotional needs because of the trauma I've faced, but I'm seen as emotionally unstable within healthcare. And so navigating just the definition can be a lot. But then when you think about, for many Black women in particular, and I can talk from my own lived experience of feeling like I'm losing my function, my ability to function, and you've got a very strong sort of narrative in your head of, I need to be this strong Black woman for my family, or I need to do great things at the workplace, or everyone at work describes me in a really positive way. It can be very difficult to ask for help until it reaches to a point where you're no longer just navigating a little bit of negative feelings, but you are really in a point of severe crisis. And I think that's a huge point of why, as well as other areas of racism, of why Black people in general have such high section rates, or it being involuntarily sectioned, because we sit on a problem or an invisible feeling that we're unable to describe because we haven't been given the language or the permission to explore our feelings in a way that's healthy. I think for so many Black people, we have a distrust of healthcare in general because we know the outcomes are poor. We know that the books that they use don't look at our skin color. We know that they don't necessarily understand us as well. And the reason why I say that is because, again, with that lived experience, I've gone to therapists or psychotherapists or doctors, and they've said, I don't really understand what you mean by this because I'm not Black. So can you just explain what this experience is like for a Black person? And in that point of I'm needing medical care, I've become an educator in a space where my mental health has declined to the point where I'm asking for help, which means I'm desperate as a Black person. And so I think we aren't allowed to be weak within the healthcare system, physical pain or mental health pain. And so we suffer. I think there's so many issues in regards to how we come across of what our pain looks like. And there's so much stigma that we have to internally fight from within our community as well as outside of it. Because I'm a third generation Jamaican, so that means my family came over to Britain in the 1950s from Jamaica, and I've grown up with narratives that having poor mental health is wrong, even though so many people who came over as part of the Windrush generation have had to navigate such severe racism, being one of the very few people of colour to come over and rebuild Britain after the war. They had such a harsh experience. So many of us have grown up with parents or grandparents that are navigating poor mental health due to the racism that they faced. And they don't have not even the language to talk about it, but they're not willing to express how they feel because there is a fear of, if I talk about this, I'll be sectioned because we know the statistics. Or if I talk about this, I'm going to be dosed up on medication because we've witnessed other people within our community who have gone from, this is a vibrant person that I knew that was struggling with this problem, to somebody that I don't recognize anymore. And so there's so much in health inequity that impacts our community in a way that, of course, impacts the workplace. Because for me, I started to obviously mentally decline to the point where I started to self-harm, and then I started to not engage with services anymore because I felt like I wasn't understood by those services, and I felt intimidating in certain spaces because I was constantly being asked to describe an experience as a Black woman when really I just wanted to be heard. And then when I was given a Black doctor to talk about my experiences because they thought that would be helpful, this doctor also had quite negative views of, well, you can't let them see us as weak, so you have to pull yourself up, Sanisha. You're strong. Come on, look at all these different things you've been through. And really quite a motivational speech, but the wrong speech for somebody that was in the place that I was in. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that Black people, Black women specifically, we are not allowed to embrace our pain. By us not being able to embrace our pain in the workplace, it causes us to, of course, have negative performance outcomes because you're struggling with so much. And for me, I need specific, reasonable adjustments to ensure that I perform at my best. I need a specific way of being given feedback so I don't internalize negative feedback as the world hates me now because I go back to that child that felt like I was hated or felt like I didn't belong. I suffer from black and white thinking, which is really difficult to explain to someone who doesn't experience it. And so I find it very hard when things are negative to see something as positive. And so I can really stay in a negative mindset for a very long time. How can I be productive in the workplace if you don't understand that experience or not willing to talk about the experience without, of course, acknowledging that the health outcomes for us are poor? And so I think way more should be done, particularly for organizations that can afford to ensure that people can work flexibly, can talk about their reasonable adjustments that are useful for them, because there's no specific playbook for one individual. You have to talk to the person. It's so important. I think also organizations have to be willing to put their money where their mouth is. And it's important to talk about money when we talk about Black women, because of course we are affected by the gender pay gap, but also we are affected by the ethnicity pay gap. And so we are not able to access private healthcare. And so that means that the issues we are dealing with, the health issues we are dealing with, exacerbate to a point because we have to navigate NHS waiting times, which we all know is very long. And so the issues get worse. And that means that we either have to leave the workplace or we're off for a long time. And so how do you ensure that we stay at work? How do you ensure that we stay healthy? How do you take care of your staff in a way that really shows you take care of your staff instead of just a statement? And so I would love to see more commitments of organizations that can afford it, doing more to ensure that the health of their staff of colour are protected, because navigating racism as well as sexism, as well as all the other issues that happen in our society, it's too much. And how can you ensure that anyone can do what they need to do at work? And then I also want to just quickly talk about maternity, because I recently had my first child a few months ago, and navigating going off on maternity leave, I constantly felt like, oh, you're going to have a child, so that means you're not going to be able to do this thing now. And so either opportunities were no longer considered for me, or people I felt forgotten at times. And I think we know the statistics that Black women in the UK are 4 times more likely, I think it's 5 times now, more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth than white women. And that we have to be acutely aware of that specific statistic, because there was so much fear for me when I was going to deliver my child, because I knew I potentially would not leave the hospital. There's also, and that of course impacted my ability to work, it impacted my ability to plan long-term development and think about long-term projects when you don't know if you're going to leave. And there was little conversation with people that knew me really well, but there's still little conversation for other workplaces when they're talking about maternity, and they're not really being specific and really understanding that Black women face a huge fear when we find out we're pregnant. And so we have to be willing to talk about that.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think understanding that depth of context and the interlinked experiences is really, really crucial, because I know that this, the most recent International Women's Day, it was #embrace equity. Well, what does embracing equity look like? Well, it looks like a lot of the things you just talked about there, actually understanding the history, the statistics, the experiences, the different experiences, and embracing the fact that actually in some cases we need to treat different groups according to their where they're coming from and what experiences they're likely to have around systematic racism, individual forms of racism as well, and reacting to that as employers. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. We've got probably about 10 minutes left, and I would love to focus the rest of the podcast really around what we can do practically, really. So given a lot of the discussion that we've had, what is it that we either as EDI leads, as chief execs, as team leaders, what type of actions have you seen being beneficial when it comes to actually really highlighting and embracing equitable approaches, particularly to Black women within the workplace? And also, are there any particular things that you think that we should avoid, or ways that organisations have approached this that have fallen short? So it'd be great to get any insights from you about what we could be doing better.
Yeah, okay. I will start with the negative of what I've seen, and then I want to end on a positive of what I've seen of organisations doing really, or what I would suggest moving forward. And so the negatives really are not being willing to own up to the mistakes that have happened within your organisation. So there are so many times I work with such amazing organizations that have the resources to really make big changes, but they are unwilling to acknowledge the cases that have happened. And so with every organization that I work with, there are a number of people that have had grievances or have had issues, Black people that do not feel that their voices are heard. And instead of talking about that and really decentering whiteness within that, they're shut down and the conversation doesn't happen. And I think CEOs, other HR leads, all leaders within organizations need to be willing to acknowledge that the conversation is often not about you as an individual, but it's about what racism or what sexism does to an individual trying to progress. And so that's where you need to think about, how do I transfer the benefits of my privilege to those who lack it? How do I level the playing field within my own organization? Whether that is specific programs that try to elevate the number of women of color at a senior exec level, because there is nowhere near enough. How do I take on this struggle as my own? And the reason why I say taking on this struggle, it is a struggle because as a Black woman, you've gone through so much to get to the same position as others who maybe do not face the same level of racism that you do. And so you are exhausted by the time. I like I said, when I describe my life, I talk about my childhood because it's such a huge part of the foundation of who I am. And so there's so much that happened in that point. I'm exhausted by my 20s. And now I've got to work till 68, navigating this. How? How do I keep this up? How do I keep being well within this place? And that's why you have to see it as a struggle, because it is a struggle in the workplace, because you've had to navigate so much when you are a marginalized individual. And so it's really important for allies who call themselves allies. Again, I don't encourage anyone to do that as well. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's more helpful to demonstrate your allyship through consistent actions. And so really being, when somebody, instead of telling me, oh, my ally to the Black community, I've read Renee Eddie Lodge's book, and or I listen to Akala all the time. People say that to me and expect me to praise them. That's not helping the struggle in the workplace. However, if you told me practical examples of how you've increased promotions for Black women specifically, how you have ensured that Black women can access training, how you have provided health insurance for Black women or people within your organization because you recognize they're marginalized and you recognize their experience is going to be negative or have specific negative outcomes. Until you do those practical work, I can't really see you as an ally. And so it's important to understand that education is up to you and nobody else. It's really important that you come to podcasts and attend live sessions like today and ask questions or get in touch with people to find out more. That's important. But you also have to do the work as well, because some of us have been doing the work, as I've described, since we were children, navigating racism or sexism. And so really be willing to challenge the system by addressing those who are oppressing others. You cannot be an ally if you do not advocate for change within the leadership of our government. You cannot be an ally when you are just sitting by and knowing that there are certain things happening that, of course, whether that's in education or within the workplace in general or legislation, and you are just going along with it. You have to be willing to make yourself be uncomfortable and take on that struggle, because that's the only way we're going to lead to change. We can't do it on our own. And the reason why I say that is not because we aren't capable, it's because the system of racism and sexism is so oppressive. There is no way any of us will survive long enough to be able to do it without burning ourselves out. And so be a true ally by taking on this fight with us.
Thank you. Really, really clear call to action there. Thank you, Sanisha. And I just want to add to that in terms of the kind of practical steps, if anyone's kind of not knowing where to go next with this discussion. I think for me, it's around data, and it's about going back to what we discussed at the beginning of the podcast. Do you know, when you break down the gender kind of proportion of your organisation, do you know how many Black women are at each level? We know very clearly, for example, within the NHS, there are clear kind of glass or concrete ceilings, depending on how you look at it. Are you aware of that within your organisation? If not, are you putting pressure on your HR teams to actually be able to clearly and visibly share that data so you can see where the issues lay within your organisation? I think because we know that such a high proportion of Black women in particular are leaving the workplace because of these microaggressions and issues, are you actually proactively asking people to tell you what their experience has been in a way that's safe? Are you doing stay interviews rather than exit interviews across the board so that you can pick up on some of these issues before they escalate into someone leaving the organisation? So there's a number of practical things that you can do. I think definitely looking at fair promotions and debiasing those systems to make sure that whoever's responsible for promotions has targets, has really clear targets on what you're trying to achieve, particularly around intersectionality and gender. So I think there's lots of practical ways that you can take that call for action that Sanisha has really kindly shared forward. We've come to the end of the podcast already. It's come really, really quickly. There's loads more we could talk about Sanisha, and I would love to encourage everyone that's joined today to look Sanisha up, to have a look at her TED Talk, to invite her to speak. She's been a fantastic guest today, and I'd just like to thank you again for joining us, Sanisha, and thank everyone else for joining us today. Just a couple of points. It'd be great if you could complete a short survey, which we're going to circulate, just to tell us what you liked, what you think we could do better, because we're really keen to continue offering content that's useful. And also to say we hope that you'll join us next time, because we'll be next meeting on the 7th of June as part of Pride Month, and we'll be talking specifically around transgender and how we can elevate the transgender experience within the workplace. So we really hope you can join us again then. But just like to thank you all for attending, and we will see you next time. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.